Picture a small boat tossed for days by an Atlantic storm, its crew soaked, half frozen, and completely lost. When the weather finally breaks, they spot land, but it isn't the coast they expected. It's a frozen, unfamiliar shore. As they wait out the last of the storm in a sheltered inlet, they make a grim discovery: a man's body lying face down in the snow. He's dressed head to toe in sealskin, the clothing of the Arctic's indigenous hunters. But when they turn him over, his face tells a different story: pale skin, red hair. He's one of them. A Norseman, dead and alone, thousands of kilometers from anywhere his people were supposed to be. Who was he? How long had he survived out here? And why was he wearing the clothes of a people the Norse considered their rivals? That single frozen body, found sometime in the 1500s, is one of the last physical traces of a civilization that thrived and then completely disappeared on the edge of the known world: the Norse colony of Greenland. This is the story of how Viking settlers built farms, churches, and a functioning society on one of the most hostile coastlines on Earth, kept it running for roughly 450 years, and then vanished so thoroughly that for centuries afterward, nobody in Europe could say for certain what had happened to them. When people think about who discovered the Americas, the name that usually comes up first is Christopher Columbus, sailing in 1492. But Europeans had already been crossing the Atlantic and setting foot on North American soil for roughly 500 years before Columbus was even born. The people who got there first were Norse sailors from Scandinavia. The seafarers' history remembers as Vikings. By the standards of their era, Norse ships were extraordinary technology. Long, narrow, flexible-hulled vessels designed to flex with the waves rather than fight them, powered by a single square sail and rows of oars. They allowed small crews to cross open ocean in conditions that would sink most other ships of the time. Using those ships, Norse settlers didn't just raid distant coastlines, they colonized them, pushing steadily westward from Norway to the Faroe Islands, to Iceland, to Greenland, and ultimately to the edge of Canada itself. The chain of events that led to Greenland actually starts in Iceland. Around the year 874, Norse settlers arrived on this volcanic, previously uninhabited island in the North Atlantic. Land in Norway itself was scarce and heavily contested, so Iceland, despite its harsh climate, looked like an opportunity. The colonization was remarkably fast. Within about 60 years, well over 1,000 farms had been established, and the population had grown into the thousands. But an island only has so much usable land, and by the early 900s, most of the good farmland in Iceland had already been claimed. For anyone arriving late, or anyone forced to leave their existing home, options were running out. That's the world into which our next major figure was born. Erik Thorvaldsson, better remembered as Erik the Red, was born in Norway around the year 950. His father Thorvald was banished from Norway after killing a man during a dispute, and the family relocated to Iceland while Erik was still a boy, arriving late enough that they were left with poor, marginal land in the island's northwest. Erik seems to have inherited his father's temper along with his father's misfortune. As an adult, a landslide caused by workers on Erik's property damaged a neighbor's farm. The furious neighbor retaliated by killing some of Erik's men, and Erik responded by killing the neighbor himself. Under Icelandic law at the time, this resulted in Erik being sentenced to several years of exile. With enemies at home and nowhere obvious to go, Erik gathered a crew and sailed west, chasing rumors that Icelandic sailors had told for years, stories of land glimpsed in the mist, far out across the ocean, by ships blown badly off course. In 982, Erik found it. After a dangerous crossing of roughly 1,500 kilometers through ice-choked seas, he reached the southern tip of a massive, glacier-covered island and spent his years of exile mapping its coastline, eventually finding sheltered fjords with patches of green vegetation among otherwise brutal terrain. When his exile ended, Erik returned to Iceland with a plan, and a now famous piece of marketing. He named his icy discovery Greenland, reasoning, according to later saga accounts, that a more appealing name would attract more settlers than the truth would. It worked. In the summer of 985 or 986, Erik led a fleet of roughly 25 ships loaded with settlers, livestock, and supplies back across the ocean. Only about 14 of those ships made it. The rest were lost to storms or turned back. Even so, it was enough people to found a permanent colony. The Norse in Greenland established two main settlement areas along the island's southwestern coast: the larger eastern settlement, near where Erik himself built his farm, and a smaller western settlement further up the coast. Despite the name Erik had given the island, the vast majority of Greenland, more than 4/5 of its landmass, is buried under a permanent ice sheet up to several kilometers thick. The settlers were confined to a narrow strip of fjordside land, squeezed between that ice sheet and the sea. And yet, remarkably, they didn't just survive there. They built a working, layered society. Archaeological evidence shows the Norse fertilized their thin Arctic soils with manure to keep them productive, raised cattle, sheep, and goats, and maintained large communal barns to shelter livestock through the brutal winters. Written sources mention dairy staples like cheese and butter as important parts of the diet. Excavated ruins at the site known as Garthar, believed to be the settlement's religious center, include the remains of a stone cathedral complete with imported stained glass and a bronze bell, a startling level of investment for a colony perched on the edge of the habitable world. The Greenland Norse survived through a combination of farming, hunting, and, most importantly for their finances, trade. Greenland turned out to sit near massive populations of walrus, especially around a bay in the north of the settlement zone, and walrus ivory was extraordinarily valuable in medieval Europe, used for carved luxury items and religious art. Records suggest that a single shipload of walrus tusks could be worth as much as hundreds of cattle. The Norse also hunted narwhal and sold the animal's long spiral tusk in Europe as unicorn horn, a substance believed at the time to have magical protective properties and worth staggering sums. At its height, historians estimate the Greenland Norse population may have reached somewhere in the low thousands, spread across roughly a couple hundred farms. It's worth pausing on just how remarkable this achievement really was. Norway is separated from Greenland by around 1,500 kilometers of open, storm-battered ocean, and the crossing was never routine. Ships had to navigate without a compass, relying on the position of the sun and stars, the flight patterns of seabirds, and generations of accumulated sailing knowledge passed down by word of mouth. Worse, Greenland sits inside a powerful current that drags sea ice, including icebergs the size of small mountains, down its eastern coast and back up along the west. Norse sailors sometimes describe this belt of drifting ice almost the way a modern sailor might describe a minefield, something to be threaded through carefully, at real risk to life. Sagas record sailors whose entire livelihood involved combing the eastern coastline for the wreckage and the bodies of ships that hadn't made it. For those who did survive the crossing, day-to-day life was organized around the short Arctic growing season and the long, punishing winter that followed it. Average summer temperatures in the settled fjords rarely climbed above about 10 degrees C, and winter cold could plunge far below freezing for months at a stretch. During the darkest weeks of winter, the sun barely rose above the horizon at all. During midsummer, by contrast, the sun barely set. Cattle were prized status symbols, kept through the winter in large communal barns whose surviving stone foundations are still impressive to look at today, some large enough to have sheltered around 100 animals. Because the animals spent so many months standing still in the dark, chronicles note that farmers sometimes had to physically carry weakened cattle back out to pasture once spring finally arrived, their legs too stiff from inactivity to walk on their own. The Norse were not the first people in Greenland, and they weren't the only ones there for long. When they arrived, they found traces of earlier inhabitants, remains linked to the Dorset culture, an earlier Arctic people. Over the following centuries, contact increased with the Thule people, ancestors of today's Inuit, who were themselves spreading across the Arctic from the west. Relations between the two groups were complicated, sometimes cooperative, sometimes hostile. Archaeological finds show genuine trade. Norse metal tools, ship fittings, and even game pieces have turned up at Inuit sites well beyond the areas the Norse are known to have settled, and it appears the Inuit picked up a handful of Norse loanwords. But there are also records and oral traditions preserved among the Inuit describing violent clashes. A Norse chronicle records an Inuit attack on the eastern settlement in 1379 that killed 18 men and resulted in 2 captives being taken. The Norse, for their part, seem never to have developed a durable, lasting peace with their neighbors, a failure that becomes significant later in this story. The same restless drive that carried Norse settlers to Greenland pushed some of them even further. Erik the Red's son, Leif Erikson, is generally credited in the sagas with reaching the North American mainland, after being blown off course during a voyage from Norway back to Greenland around the turn of the 11th century. He and his crew found a coastline with wild grapes and wheat, which they named Vinland. Subsequent expeditions followed with mixed results. One, led by Leif's brother Thorvald, ended in disaster. After an unprovoked attack on a group of sleeping indigenous people, the Norse were pursued and Thorvald himself was killed by an arrow. These early, often violent encounters may help explain why the Norse never established a permanent foothold in North America, despite reaching it 5 centuries before Columbus. Today, only one confirmed Norse site has been found in North America, Elance Ox Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada, discovered in 1960. Excavations there uncovered turf-walled buildings matching Norse, not indigenous, construction methods, along with a carpentry workshop and ironworking forge, but no burials, farms, or signs of permanent habitation. It looks to have functioned as a temporary base, likely used for repairing ships and gathering timber, a resource Greenland itself sorely lacked, rather than a colony in its own right. Even at its most prosperous, the Greenland colony was never fully self-sufficient. Certain essentials simply couldn't be produced locally, especially timber and iron, both of which had to be imported from Norway. Greenland's landscape offered only scrubby, low-growing willow and birch, nothing close to the tall, straight timber needed to build or repair a proper ocean-going ship. A story recorded from the 12th century illustrates just how precarious this dependency was. A Greenlander is said to have built his own vessel from scratch, using whatever scraps of wood he could gather, held together with wooden pegs and rope rather than proper iron nails and rivets. He actually managed to sail it successfully all the way to Iceland, an impressive feat of improvisation that reportedly drew crowds of curious onlookers, amazed that such an ungainly craft had survived the crossing at all. But on the next leg of his journey toward Norway, the makeshift joints of the ship gave way, and he was lost at sea. It's a small story, but a telling one. It shows both the resourcefulness of the Greenland Norse and the hard limits of what that resourcefulness could achieve without a reliable supply line back to Europe. For roughly its first 3 centuries, the Greenland colony existed during what's now called the medieval warm period, a stretch of relatively mild climate across the North Atlantic that made both the sea crossing and Arctic farming more forgiving than they otherwise would have been. That began to change around the late 1200s as the world slid into what's known as the Little Ice Age, a centuries-long cooling trend whose causes are still debated by researchers, with candidates ranging from reduced solar activity to a cluster of major volcanic eruptions to shifts in ocean circulation. Whatever combination of causes was responsible, the effect on Greenland was severe. Sea ice expanded, making the crossing from Europe more dangerous and less frequent. Growing seasons shortened, storms grew more common and more violent. For a long time, the standard explanation for what followed was blunt: that the Norse settlers stubbornly clung to a European farming lifestyle that was simply unworkable as the climate worsened, refused to adapt, and starved as a result. There's real evidence supporting parts of this picture. Well into the 1400s, Norse Greenlanders were still buried in European-style wool clothing rather than the more effective sealskin and fur worn by their Inuit neighbors, and their farming methods likely accelerated soil erosion in an already fragile landscape. But more recent archaeological work complicates that story considerably. Studies of animal bones from Norse rubbish middens show a dramatic dietary shift over time, with seal meat eventually making up as much as 80% of what the Greenlanders ate in the settlement's final generations. A clear sign of real adaptation, not blind stubbornness. There's also evidence the Norse hunted selectively, targeting the more abundant harp seal over the more vulnerable, easily hunted harbor seal, suggesting a level of conscious resource management rather than reckless exploitation. Even so, skeletal remains from the settlement's later period show signs of serious malnutrition, stunted growth, and heavily worn teeth from a poor-quality diet, indicating that adaptation alone wasn't enough to solve the underlying problem. Greenland's economy and survival depended on a fragile thread connecting it back to mainland Europe, ships bringing timber, iron, and grain, and carrying away walrus ivory and furs in return. Through the 1300s, that thread began to snap. The Black Death reached Norway in 1349, killing a huge share of the population. Estimates for Norway's mortality run as high as 40 to 60%, and devastating the shipbuilding and trading infrastructure that Greenland relied on. Then, in 1393, pirates attacked and burned the Norwegian port city of Bergen, from which Greenland-bound ships typically departed, further disrupting what little traffic remained. Around the same time, the value of walrus ivory, Greenland's key export, began collapsing in European markets as Portuguese trade routes opened up access to superior African elephant ivory. The archaeological record shows the consequences of this isolation directly. Excavated Norse sites contain increasingly few iron objects in their upper, later layers, along with tools worn down to almost nothing from repeated reuse, evidence of a community that could no longer easily replace basic metal goods. The first sign that something had gone badly wrong came from Greenland's smaller western settlement. Its last recorded tax payment to Norway arrived in 1327. For over a decade after that, nothing, no word, no ships, no payments. Eventually, a man named Ivar Bardarsson was sent to investigate. What he found, according to surviving accounts, was a settlement completely empty. No bodies, no signs of battle or fire, just abandoned farms with livestock still wandering loose. Bardarsson assumed the settlers had been killed in a raid, but the absence of any physical evidence of violence left the explanation deeply unsatisfying, then and now. The larger eastern settlement held on for roughly another century, but the final decades appear to have been increasingly desperate. Excavated farm sites from this period show grim evidence of hardship. The butchered remains of animals that would ordinarily have been far too valuable to eat, including working dogs, alongside signs that people had begun eating parts of livestock, like cow hooves, that would normally have gone to waste, and hunting small animals they previously wouldn't have bothered with. The last confirmed written record connected to the Greenland Norse describes a wedding at Valsey Church in 1408, a stone church whose ruins still stand today, making it the best-preserved Norse building anywhere in Greenland. After that entry, written references to the colony largely stop. By around 1435, archaeological evidence suggests the Norse presence in Greenland had ended entirely. There isn't a single confirmed answer, and that's part of what makes this story endure. Several explanations have been proposed, and they aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. Starvation and collapse. The bleakest theory holds that, squeezed by worsening climate, a collapsing trade network, and a shrinking population of able-bodied hunters, the Greenland Norse simply couldn't sustain themselves any longer. Some archaeological finds support this directly: a farmhouse buried in drifting sand, insect remains suggesting unburied bodies at least one site, and the general trajectory of malnutrition visible in later skeletons. Quiet emigration. Other evidence points toward a more gradual, less catastrophic ending, people simply leaving, a few families or individuals at a time, drifting back to Iceland or Norway as conditions worsened and opportunities at home didn't materialize. Notably, most later period human remains found in Greenland belong to older individuals, suggesting younger people may have left first, seeking better prospects elsewhere, a pattern familiar from more recent economic declines. Some sites show signs of an orderly departure, valuables removed and doors reportedly closed behind the last residents, rather than a chaotic final collapse. A journey west. And then there's the more speculative, almost haunting possibility that at least some of the Greenland Norse didn't retreat toward Europe at all, but turned the other way. Toward the North American coastline their ancestors had already explored generations earlier. It was, after all, a considerably shorter and less dangerous voyage than the trip back across the open Atlantic to Norway. A 17th-century account references a claim that the Greenland settlers had turned to the people of America, and Icelandic records from 1347 mention a ship that arrived off course, its crew reporting they had been sailing from Vinland, suggesting Norse voyages west were still happening deep into the settlement's declining years. Support for this theory doesn't stop there. In 1723, a Norwegian-Danish missionary named Hans Egede sailed to Greenland, specifically hopping, to find descendants of the Old Norse colony still living there. A sign that, even centuries later, people in Scandinavia hadn't entirely given up hope that the settlers might have survived somewhere. Egede found only ruins, but while living among the local Inuit population, he asked whether they knew what had become of the old stone buildings scattered along the coast. According to his own account, he was told that it was the Norwegians themselves who had torn down at least one of the buildings, implying a deliberate, controlled departure rather than a sudden catastrophe. It's a small, ambiguous detail, but it fits awkwardly with the picture of a colony that simply collapsed and froze in place. If any Greenlanders did make that crossing, their fate is unknown. Maybe they met the same hostile reception Thorvald Eriksson's expedition had centuries earlier. Or maybe, and this is the possibility that keeps this story alive in the popular imagination, some of them did what desperate, adaptable people have always done. They integrated. They may have learned to hunt like their neighbors, dressed like their neighbors, and over enough generations, simply become part of a different community altogether. Which brings the story back to where it began: a nameless man found dead on a Greenland beach centuries ago. Red-haired and pale-skinned but dressed head to toe as an Inuit hunter, we'll likely never know his exact story, but he stands as a strangely fitting symbol for the entire Greenland colony, a European civilization that, faced with an impossible environment, tried to hold onto its old identity for as long as it could, and then, in the end, either vanished into the ice or quietly became something else entirely. Because Greenland's climate is so extreme, it has preserved evidence that would have rotted away almost anywhere else on Earth. Frozen and desiccated soil has kept fragments of Norse clothing intact for over 5 centuries, some still showing traces of dye, deep reds and blues, as vivid as the day they were dyed. These finds have told historians as much about the Greenland Norse as any written record: what fashions they favored, how closely they clung to European styles even as their circumstances grew more desperate, and roughly when those styles finally stopped being renewed. The physical remains of the settlements are just as evocative. Church ruins built from quarried stone still stand along the fjords, their doorways framed with blocks so large that early visitors compared them to the standing stones of Stonehenge. Barn foundations, farm walls, and the outlines of long-vanished fields are still visible on the landscape today, a faint grid pressed into hillsides that have otherwise reverted to Arctic tundra. Modern archaeologists continue to return to these sites, and each new excavation season tends to complicate the story a little further, adding evidence of adaptation here, hardship there, refining a picture that historians once thought was much simpler than it actually was. The story of the Greenland Norse has also outlived its own written record in a more unexpected way. Through Inuit oral tradition, stories describing early encounters with red-haired, pale-skinned newcomers were passed down for generations among Inuit communities, describing both trade and conflict, long after the Norse settlements themselves had gone silent. These accounts, later recorded by anthropologists and folklorists, offer a rare thing in historical study, an outside perspective on a vanished culture, preserved by the very people the Norse once called Skraeling, meaning something like barbarian in the Old Norse Greenlandic dialect. That word, curiously, is one of the only fragments of that dialect to survive at all into the modern Icelandic language. For roughly 450 years, Norse settlers held on at the very edge of the habitable world, farming glacier-fed valleys, hunting walrus for a global ivory trade, building stone churches under the aurora, and even reaching the shores of North America 500 years before Columbus. Then, within the span of a couple of generations, they were gone, leaving behind ruined farms, empty churches, and one of history's genuinely unresolved mysteries. Whether the last of the Greenland Norse died where they stood, sailed home to Europe, or vanished into a new life across the ocean, their story is a reminder of just how far human beings will go to build a home, and how thin the line can be between thriving at the edge of the world and disappearing from it entirely.